On my first day at the care home, I didn't really know what to expect. I'd worked a few jobs before, but this was my first time working the night shift in a place like this. I had imagined it would be peaceful. I'd take care of some elderly residents, help them to bed, and spend most of my shift in the quiet halls, maybe even catch up on a few chapters of the book I'd stashed in my bag. I was wrong. The care home was larger than I had expected. I arrived around 10 p.m., just as the day shift was leaving. Denise, the owner, was waiting for me at the front desk with a clipboard in hand, her face pulled into that tired but friendly smile you often see in people who've worked these shifts for far too long. She gave me a rundown of my responsibilities for the night, the layout of the building, and which residents needed extra care. "There are a few you'll want to keep an eye on," she said, flipping through her papers. "Mrs. Harding, for one. She's on the second floor, room 207. Lovely lady, but she gets confused at night sometimes. Thinks her husband's still around." Denise paused, her eyes flickering toward the darkened corridor behind her. "Just make sure she's comfortable." At first, I thought it was a lot to take in all at once, but I went along with it. "Got it. Anything else I should know?" Denise hesitated, then shook her head. "Not really. Just do your rounds every hour or so. Check on the residents, and if anyone needs anything, you've got the pager." I took a deep breath and followed her to the back of the building, where the main wing split off into two long, quiet hallways. The lights were dim, and the entire place had this strange, still energy. It was too quiet for a place where so many people were living. I felt like I should be hearing more than just the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. By 11 p.m., most of the residents were already in bed. The only sounds were the occasional creak of a door or the soft mumbling of someone talking in their sleep. I made my first round, walking the length of the corridor and pausing outside each room to listen for anything unusual. Mrs. Harding's room was near the end of the hall. Her door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to peek in without disturbing her. She was sitting in bed, facing the window, her back to me. I knocked softly. "Mrs. Harding, how are you doing tonight?" She didn't respond at first, just kept staring out the window like she hadn't heard me. After a moment, she turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see her profile. Her expression was distant, almost like she wasn't fully there. "Is everything okay?" I asked, stepping inside. "Do you need anything?" She shook her head slowly. No, I'm fine. It's just..." I thought I saw him. I paused, not sure what she meant. "Saw who?" Mrs. Harding's gaze shifted back to the window. "My husband, he's been gone for years, but I thought I saw him standing right there by the tree." I followed her gaze to the window, but all I could see was the dark outline of the courtyard below. No one was out there. "I'm sure it was just a shadow," I said gently, trying to reassure her. "Sometimes when it's dark, shadows play tricks on us." Mrs. Harding nodded, but she didn't look convinced. Maybe that's all it was. I stayed with her for a few more minutes, chatting quietly until she seemed calmer. By the time I left, she was lying back in bed with her eyes closed, though I could tell she wasn't asleep yet. The rest of the night went by without incident, and by the time my shift was over, I was exhausted. But that conversation with Mrs. Harding stuck with me. There was something about the way she'd said it, the certainty in her voice when she talked about seeing her husband. It wasn't just confusion or old age. She truly believed it. The next night, my shift started much the same. I did my rounds, checked on the residents, and everything seemed normal. That is, until around 1 a.m. I was walking down the hallway making my usual stops when I heard a voice, faint and muffled, coming from Mrs. Harding's room. At first, I thought she was talking to herself, which wasn't uncommon for the residents here. But as I got closer, I realized she wasn't the only one speaking. There was another voice, lower and softer, though I couldn't make out the words. My heart started racing as I approached the door. I could see the light from her bedside lamp spilling out into the hallway. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Should I knock or just go in? Then I heard Mrs. Harding's voice again, clearer this time. "Who are you talking to?" she asked, her tone filled with confusion. There was a pause, then the low voice replied, though I still couldn't make out what it was saying. I pushed open the door, my pulse quickening. Mrs. Harding was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear, staring at the far corner of the room. There was no one else there. "Mrs. Harding?" I stepped inside, trying to stay calm. "Is everything okay?" She looked at me, her face pale. "The man? He's in the corner. He's been standing there, watching me." I looked at the corner, my stomach twisting into knots. It was empty, just a shadow cast by the lamp on her nightstand. "There's no one there," I said softly. "It's just a shadow. You're safe." Mrs. Harding shook her head, her eyes never leaving the corner. "No, he's there. I can see him. Why can't you see him?" I didn't know what to say. I stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure of how to comfort her. Eventually, I walked over to the corner and waved my hand through the air, showing her that it was empty. "See? There's no one here." But Mrs. Harding wasn't convinced. She clutched the blanket tightly. "He's still there," she whispered. I didn't argue with her. Instead, I sat with her for a while, talking softly until she finally calmed down and fell asleep. But even as I left her room, an unease settled deep inside me, and I couldn't shake it off. That night, I kept hearing things, faint whispers, soft footsteps, even when no one was around. It was as if the entire building was alive with some unseen presence. By the time my shift ended, I was on edge. I hurried out of the building, grateful for the fresh air and the sight of the rising sun. But the experience with Mrs. Harding stayed with me. There was something about the way she had stared at that empty corner, something about the fear in her voice that made me question everything I thought I knew about the care home. I went back the next night, determined to shake off the unease, but things only got worse. It was around midnight when I heard it again, the low, muffled voice coming from Mrs. Harding's room. This time, I didn't hesitate. I ran down the hallway. When I reached her door, I found it wide open. Mrs. Harding was sitting in bed, her eyes wide with terror, staring at the same corner as before. "He's back," she whispered. "He's standing right there." I looked into the corner, my skin prickling with dread. It was empty, just like the night before. But this time, something felt different. The air in the room was thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I could feel it. Something was there, even if I couldn't see it. "I need to leave," Mrs. Harding said, her voice shaking. "I can't stay here." I nodded, trying to hide my own fear. "Let's go. I'll take you to the common room." I helped her out of bed, and we slowly made our way down the hall. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was following us. Every step felt heavier than the last, like we were walking through a fog I couldn't see. When we finally reached the common room, I sat her down on one of the couches and stayed with her until she calmed down. But even as we sat there, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. I don't know what was happening in that care home, and I'm not sure I want to know. But after that night, I couldn't bring myself to go back. I quit the next day, leaving behind whatever it was that haunted Mrs. Harding's room. I just hope wherever she is now, she's found some peace, because something was in that room with her, I'm sure of it. And whatever it was watching. It was my first night working as a cleaner in one of the biggest office buildings downtown. I had just landed the job and was grateful to have it, though I had no idea what to expect. The place was massive, rows of cubicles, endless conference rooms, and long corridors that seemed to stretch forever. Even though it was after hours, the building still felt somehow alive. I'd always worked daytime jobs, so adjusting to the eerie quiet of a night shift was going to take some time. The other cleaners on the team had been there for years and knew the place inside out. They mostly kept to themselves, but that was fine with me. I didn't mind working alone. My supervisor, Carol, was the only one who gave me a proper introduction to the building. She showed me around, handed me a set of keys, and explained the areas I'd be responsible for. Most of the time, it was routine stuff: vacuuming, emptying trash, wiping down desks, simple enough. I'd be alone on the 4th floor for the night, while the rest of the crew handled the lower levels. "Oh, and by the way, you might run into Doug, the night janitor," she added before walking away. "Don't mind him. He's harmless, but a little strange. Just let him do his thing." I didn't think much of it back then. Everyone in these night jobs seemed to be a bit odd in their own way. I figured Doug would just be another quiet guy, keeping to himself while he mopped floors or fixed whatever needed fixing. But from the moment I met him, I could tell something was off. He had this unsettling way of looking at you, too long, too intense, like he was studying every inch of you for no reason. When he first approached me, it was sudden, almost out of nowhere. I was in one of the break rooms wiping down a table, when I turned around and there he was, standing in the doorway. "Hi there," he said, his lips curling into a grin, though his eyes didn't follow. "First night?" I tried not to let the weirdness of the situation get to me. "Yeah, just getting the hang of things. Let me know if you need anything," he added, his gaze unbroken. "I'm always around." That was an understatement. For the rest of the night, I kept seeing him here and there, no matter where I was. Whether I was cleaning the bathrooms or vacuuming the carpets, Doug would be there, lurking. I'd see him at the end of the hallway or just as I rounded a corner, pushing his cleaning cart, always watching. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. After all, it was a big building, and we were the only two on this floor for the night. But it happened too often for me to write it off. And it wasn't just that he was nearby, he was always looking at me, as if waiting for me to notice him. The first few times, I forced a smile, gave him a polite nod, and went back to my work. But the more it happened, the more uneasy I became. There are only so many times you can catch someone staring at you before it starts to feel wrong. At one point, I was in the kitchen, throwing out the trash, and when I turned around, Doug was standing just outside the door. I hadn't heard him come in, hadn't even seen him approach, he was just there. "Need a hand?" he asked. I shook my head quickly. "No, I'm good, thanks." He didn't leave, though. He stood there for a long moment, staring, his fingers drumming against his mop handle. Finally, he gave me that unsettling grin again and walked away without another word. I breathed a sigh of relief once he was gone, but the tension never left me. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. It was my first night, and I was probably just being paranoid. Night shifts could mess with your head, especially in a place as big and empty as this. But no matter how much I tried to shake it off, the feeling of being watched kept creeping back in. By the time my shift was nearing its end, I was more than ready to get out of there. I looked at the clock. 2:45 a.m., only 15 more minutes, and I'd be free to go. I started packing up my supplies, wiping down the last few surfaces before heading to the exit. I wasn't sure where Doug was at that point, and honestly, I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. As I made my way toward the elevator, I noticed something strange. The doors to the stairwell were slightly ajar. I was sure they'd been closed earlier. I'd walked by them at least twice while cleaning. A flicker of doubt passed through my mind, but I ignored it and pressed the button for the elevator. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. Still nothing. Frustrated, I looked at the stairwell doors again, expecting Doug to come walking out, but there was no one. The building was silent, save for the faint hum of the ventilation system. I sighed, resigning myself to the stairs. After all, it was only 4 flights down. As I pushed open the door, a faint scraping sound echoed from below. I froze, listening. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like metal dragging against concrete. I peered down the staircase, but there was nothing in sight, just the dimly lit steps winding downward. I shook my head and started descending. Maybe Doug was doing some kind of maintenance, or maybe I was just hearing things. Either way, I was done for the night and just wanted to get home. But as I reached the second floor, I heard it again. This time it was louder. The scraping sound was coming from just below me. I paused on the landing, heart racing. My hand tightened on the railing as I leaned over to peer down the stairwell again. And that's when I saw him, Doug. He was standing on the floor below, his back to me, holding a large metal object in his hand, something that looked like a pipe or a crowbar. He wasn't moving, just standing there, motionless, facing the wall. I stepped back, trying to keep quiet. My mind was racing. Why was he just standing there? What was he holding? Without thinking, I turned and bolted back up the stairs. My footsteps echoed through the stairwell as I sprinted back to the 4th floor. I ran straight to the door and slammed it shut as soon as I was through. I could hear my own breath, fast and panicked. I looked around the empty hallway, my heart still pounding. There was no way I was going back down those stairs, not with Doug lurking down there like that. I needed to get out, and I needed to get out fast. I tried the elevator again, but of course, it still wasn't working. My only option was to find another stairwell or an emergency exit. That's when I realized something horrible. Every exit I passed was locked. Panic started to set in. I tried to keep calm, tried to think logically. Maybe there was another way out, another stairwell I hadn't checked. I just needed to stay focused, keep moving, and find an exit before Doug found me. I made my way down the hall, trying to be as quiet as possible. Every door I tried was locked, every stairwell blocked. It was like the entire building was conspiring to trap me inside. Just when I was about to give up, I saw an emergency exit at the far end of the hallway. I ran toward it, desperately hoping it would be open. I pushed against the door, and to my relief, it swung open. I burst through the door and found myself staring at a metal staircase bolted to the side of the building. It clung to the wall like a lifeline, narrow and rickety, stretching 4 stories down to the ground. My legs trembled just thinking about descending that thin staircase, the sharp edges of the metal gleaming faintly under the streetlights below. But I couldn't stay. The fear gnawing at me from behind was worse than the dizziness from looking down. I grabbed the railing, feeling the cold steel under my hands as I forced myself to take the first step. Each one creaked beneath me, and my heart pounded harder with every step, but I knew I had no other option. When I reached solid ground, gasping for breath, I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block, finally stopping to catch my breath. I never went back to that building. The next day, I quit the job without explanation. A few weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that Doug had been fired, something about inappropriate behavior toward another staff member. I didn't ask for details and I didn't want to know. I'd escaped that night, but it felt like Doug had planned for me not to. And to this day, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made it out in time. I started at the law office on a cold Monday morning in November. You know how it feels when you start a new job. The jitters, the excitement, the overwhelming need to not screw things up on your first day. That was me, standing there in front of this small, slightly rundown building that looked more like a house than an office. I wasn't exactly sure what kind of law firm I was walking into. The ad hadn't provided many details, just a generic description of administrative tasks and occasional errands. But the pay was decent, and I needed the money. The inside of the building felt just as old as the outside. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper that might have been from the 70s, and the furniture looked like it had seen better days. There was a distinct musty smell, as if the place hadn't been aired out in a while. "Welcome. You must be Tiana," said a voice from behind me. I turned to see a woman in her mid-50s standing in the hallway. Her name was Janet, the office manager, and she had that no-nonsense attitude that made you feel like you needed to walk on eggshells around her. She didn't smile much either, just looked at me like she was sizing me up. "Come on, I'll show you where your desk is," she said, turning and walking down the narrow hallway. The office was small, only a handful of rooms. There was the main office where Janet worked, and then a few other rooms I assumed were for the lawyers. My desk was tucked into a corner near the back, right by a window that looked out onto an alley. It wasn't much, but I didn't mind. I wasn't here to make friends or impress anyone. I just needed a paycheck. Janet didn't waste any time showing me the ropes. I was mostly answering phones, sorting through old case files, and running small errands. It was quiet work, and to be honest, a little boring. There weren't many people coming in and out of the office, which struck me as odd for a law firm, but I figured it was just one of those small-town operations that didn't get much foot traffic. Around noon, I was starting to settle into the routine when Janet approached my desk. She had a large manila envelope in her hand, sealed shut. "I need you to take this to an address for me," she said, handing me the envelope. "It's not far, just a short drive. Leave it in the mailbox." "Sure," I replied, taking the envelope. There was no address on it, just my name scribbled in black marker. I waited for her to give me more instructions, but she just stared at me. "Should I get a signature or anything?" I asked, trying to clarify. "No, just drop it off," she said flatly. Then she turned and walked away. Before I could ask anything else, I grabbed my coat and headed for the car, feeling a little confused but not thinking too much of it. It was an errand, nothing more. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why wouldn't they just use the mail? And why was my name on the envelope? As I punched the address Janet had given me into my GPS, my stomach twisted slightly. The location was in the outskirts of town, a part I wasn't familiar with. The drive took me through winding back roads, past abandoned lots and old, decrepit houses. It was a gloomy day, the sky overcast, making the already eerie surroundings seem even more unsettling. Finally, I reached the address. It wasn't what I expected at all. The place was an old building, large but falling apart at the seams. The windows were boarded up, and the entire property was surrounded by overgrown weeds and a rusted fence. There were no signs of life anywhere. No cars in the driveway, no lights in the windows. Just silence and decay. I sat in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, wondering if I had made a wrong turn. I double-checked the address, but it matched what Janet had given me. This was definitely the place. As I looked at the envelope again, a feeling of unease crept over me. Why was I delivering something here, to this abandoned building? Still, I reasoned it wasn't my job to ask questions. Maybe this was some legal matter, and they just needed the package left here for whoever owned the place. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and made my way to the front gate. The mailbox was old and rusted, barely hanging onto the post, but it was there. I slipped the envelope inside and was about to walk back to the car when I heard a creak. I froze, turning toward the sound. It came from one of the upstairs windows, one of the few that wasn't boarded up. I scanned the dark, cracked glass, but I didn't see anything at first. Then I noticed it. A shadow, barely visible in the dim light. Someone was standing there, watching me from the second-floor window. My heart leaped into my throat, and I quickly turned and hurried back to my car. As I fumbled with the keys, I looked up again, but the figure was gone. The window was empty now, just a dark void staring back at me. I started the car and sped away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but that place, whoever was watching me, it wasn't normal. When I got back to the office, Janet didn't even ask if I had delivered the envelope. She just nodded when I walked in and went back to her work, as if nothing had happened. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the window, the way they had just stood there watching me. I convinced myself it was probably nothing. Maybe someone was squatting in the building, and I had startled them. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The next day, things got even stranger. Janet handed me another envelope, this time with no explanation, no address, no instructions. Just a quiet, "Take care of it." I didn't know what that meant, but I wasn't about to argue. I took the envelope and got into my car, waiting for my GPS to tell me where I was headed. It led me back to the same building. I hesitated when I pulled up in front of the rusted gate. The same sense of dread washed over me, stronger this time. I told myself I could drop the envelope and leave quickly. No need to look around. No need to be curious. But when I walked up to the gate, something caught my eye. The window, the same one where I had seen the figure the day before, it was open now, just slightly, as if someone had pried it loose. I could see a tattered curtain blowing in the breeze. The building itself still looked abandoned, but there was something off about it that I couldn't explain. I slipped the envelope into the mailbox and quickly turned to leave. But before I could take 2 steps, I heard it again, a creak from the window. This time, I didn't look back. I ran to my car, threw the door open, and sped off without a second thought. When I got back to the office, Janet was waiting for me. She didn't say a word, just gave me that same strange look, like she knew something I didn't. I wanted to ask her about the building, about the person I had seen, but something held me back. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the open window. Why had it been closed before? And who was watching me? I called a friend, someone who had lived in the town for a long time, and asked them about the building. After a long pause, they told me that the place had been abandoned for years. No one had lived there since a fire had gutted the inside a decade ago. It was condemned unsafe, and no one went near it anymore. So who had I seen in that window? The next day I came into work dreading another assignment, but Janet didn't give me an envelope this time. Instead, she handed me a letter. It was addressed to me. Inside was a single sentence: "Stop asking questions." I looked up at Janet, but she was already walking away, her face as expressionless as ever. I quit the next day. To this day, I still don't know what was in those envelopes, who was watching me from the window, or how she knew I asked someone about the building. But sometimes, when I drive past the outskirts of town, I can't help but look toward that old building, expecting to see someone standing there watching me again. Whatever was going on in that law office, I wanted no part of it. It was my first day working at the bookstore, a quaint little shop tucked into the corner of an old building downtown. From the outside, it looked like any other small business. Aged brick walls, big display windows filled with paperbacks, and a faded sign swinging in the breeze. I was excited. I loved books, and working here seemed like a dream. It was a quiet gig with the occasional customer drifting in and out, and the owner, Mr. Langley, seemed nice enough when I met him. I arrived early that morning, eager to make a good impression. The inside of the store had the classic old bookstore vibe. The faint smell of paper and ink, shelves crammed with books from floor to ceiling, and a worn wooden counter that looked like it had seen years of use. Mr. Langley gave me a brief tour of the place before retreating to his office in the back, leaving me to manage the front desk. The day went by uneventfully at first. I organized some shelves, greeted a handful of customers, and familiarized myself with the inventory. It was the kind of peaceful, slow-paced job that let me think while I worked. By the afternoon, things had quieted down even more, and I found myself with nothing to do but flip through a book at the counter. That's when I noticed the door. It was small, almost hidden behind a stack of boxes near the back of the store, and I hadn't paid much attention to it before. It was wooden, dark, and slightly weathered, with a heavy padlock securing it shut. Curiosity got the better of me, and I wandered over to take a closer look. The door was solid, but it didn't seem to match the rest of the shop. There was something about it that felt out of place. I looked around to make sure Mr. Langley wasn't watching before crouching down to examine it. The lock looked old and rusted in places, but it was sturdy. It struck me as strange. Why would a simple bookstore need a locked door like this? What could possibly be back there? My mind immediately started imagining hidden storage, maybe a dusty cellar filled with old first editions, or some kind of forgotten part of the building. But something about it felt weird. I wasn't sure why, but standing in front of that door made me uneasy, like I wasn't supposed to be there. Just as I was about to walk away, Mr. Langley appeared from the back, his eyes narrowing slightly when he saw me standing near the door. "That's locked for a reason," he said, his voice firmer than it had been earlier. "There's nothing back there you need to worry about, just old storage." I nodded quickly, feeling a bit embarrassed for snooping. "Sorry, I was just curious." He gave me a tight smile. "Curiosity can be dangerous in a place like this." His words hung in the air for a moment, and I couldn't tell if he was joking or serious. Either way, I decided it was best to steer clear of that door. I returned to the front of the shop and spent the rest of the afternoon organizing books, trying to shake off the strange feeling Mr. Langley's comment had left me with. As the evening approached, Mr. Langley came up to the counter with his coat in hand. "I'm heading out for the day," he said. "You'll close up tonight. Should be pretty quiet. Just make sure to lock the front door and turn off the lights when you leave." I nodded, hiding the fact that I was a little nervous about being left alone on my first day. "Got it." He left with a quick nod, and soon the shop was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet. I busied myself with tidying up, trying to pass the time until closing, but as the hour ticked by and the last bit of daylight faded, the atmosphere in the bookstore seemed to shift. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow, and every little noise seemed louder than it should have been. I chalked it up to first-day jitters and kept working, but that uneasy feeling lingered. It wasn't long before I heard it, a soft thud, almost like something being dropped coming from the back of the store. My heart skipped a beat as I strained to listen. The sound came again, this time a little louder. It was coming from the direction of the locked door. I put down the stack of books I was holding and cautiously made my way to the back. The closer I got to the door, the more I realized the sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic. Thud, pause, thud, pause, like someone was knocking from the other side. My mouth went dry as I stood in front of the door, staring at the rusted padlock. The knocking stopped suddenly, leaving only the faint hum of the overhead lights. I told myself it was probably nothing, just the old building settling, or maybe a draft pushing something against the door. But then I heard it again. A faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable, came from behind the door. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice sounded weak, almost pleading. My heart raced, and every instinct told me to turn around, walk away, and forget about it. But I couldn't. I had to know. I reached for the padlock, expecting it to be ice cold under my fingers, but it wasn't. It felt normal, just a lock. I tugged on it, testing its strength, but it didn't budge. The door remained firmly closed, and the whispers stopped. Taking a shaky breath, I backed away, my mind racing with possibilities. Was someone trapped back there, or was it just my mind messing with me? I wanted to believe the latter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone and typed out a quick text to Mr. Langley, asking if everything was okay and mentioning the strange noises. He didn't reply right away, so I decided to finish my tasks and leave as soon as possible. But the noises didn't stop. As I was shelving the last few books, I heard another thud, followed by a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. This time it was louder, more distinct. The whispers returned too, though I still couldn't make out what they were saying. I looked at the time. Still another hour until closing. That's when I got the text back from Mr. Langley. All it said was, "Do not open the door." My stomach tightened, and my hands shook as I reread the message. He hadn't explained why, hadn't given any context. Just a direct, almost panicked warning. I stared at the door, my mind racing with questions. If there was nothing back there, why did he feel the need to send that message? Another thud, this time followed by a low groan, echoed from behind the door. My breath caught in my throat, and I found myself slowly backing away. I didn't care what was making the noise anymore. I just wanted to be out of that store. I hurried to the front, flicking off the lights and grabbing my bag. But as I reached for the front door, a loud bang came from the back. It was as if something heavy had been thrown against the door, rattling the shelves nearby. I froze, then without warning, the padlock clicked. The sound was so quiet, so subtle, but I heard it clear as day. I turned around just in time to see the padlock slip from the latch and fall to the floor with a metallic clang. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran out the door, down the street, not stopping until I was safely in my car with the doors locked. My hands trembled as I tried to process what had just happened. I never went back to that bookstore. A week later, I heard it had closed down. No explanation, no announcement, just boarded up overnight. I never found out what was behind that door, and honestly, I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet and still, I think about the whispers, about the way the door unlocked itself, and I wonder if somewhere in that dark, forgotten place, the door is still standing, waiting for someone else to open it and release whatever is in there. If these first day on the job horror stories sent chills down your spine, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling content. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. Which story gave you the creeps the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Stay safe and remember to trust your instincts, especially on your first day. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.